So it is my great pleasure to welcome my colleague Dorothee Boulanger. She's currently a Leverhulme Early Career Scholar and a Junior Research Fellow at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. This lecture was originally scheduled for the end of March, and for obvious reasons, we had to postpone it several times, so I'm really glad that we are finally able to hold it. So Dr. Boulanger is a remarkably erudite and eclectic scholar and teacher. She holds a Master of Science in Gender, Globalization and Development from the London School of Economics and an MA in International Relations from Sciences Po in Paris. This ecumenical educational background has directly impacted on and significantly enhanced both her research and the pedagogy. Dr. Boulanger's scholarship focuses on gender and Lusophone African literary studies. Her research explores the literature and intellectual history of Lusophone Africa, and it looks more precisely at the ways in which fiction shapes collective identities and historical consciousness. She pays particular attention to gender and masculinity and studies novels through an interdisciplinary lens and brings together the socio-political conditions from which this literature emerges, the role of writers and intellectuals in Lusophone Africa, and the ways in which fiction can reinforce or threaten power relations. Her PhD thesis, of which the late Patrick Chabal was one of the supervisors until his untimely death, in which she defended in 2018, examined how post-colonial Angolan novels have disrupted Lusophone colonial narratives on Africa, but also occasionally reproduced colonial symbolic violence through their unifying and male-centered perspectives. Her current research, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, endeavors to test and compare these findings in other post-colonial African contexts, namely in Algeria, Zimbabwe, and Congo, Brazzaville. Dr. Boulanger has presented her work at several academic conferences in the United Kingdom, Portugal, France, and Germany, and her research has appeared in print in English, Portuguese, and French. Her presentation today is based on her chapter in the edited volume, Gendering the Portuguese World, edited by Francisco Betancourt and Philippe Lowndes Vincent. It's forthcoming from Brill in 2021. Her lecture today is entitled Erasing Women, comparing Angolese and Postcolonial Narratives in the Late 19th Century Angola. Please help me give a warm and virtual, I don't know if those two are oxymoronic, so a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Dorothee Boulanger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And I want to thank the Center with the African Studies program at Madison, Wisconsin University. And I want to thank Alaya and Dinah for welcoming me today. I'm very happy to be doing this presentation. I hope, technologically speaking, everything goes well. And please wave if there is an issue with sound or anything that I'm not aware of. Let me share my screen with you so that you can see my PowerPoint. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'll get started. So as you'll see, my title is slightly different, but the argument very much remains the same, centering women or rehabilitating masculinity, gender literature, and late 19th century Angola. Before I start, I just need to put up a little trigger warning. This presentation will be mentioning violence and sexual violence against women, as well as suicide. So over to the presentation, structure. I will first look, what I want to do today is compare 4 novels that were written over the span of 100 years. So I'll start with the presentation of the 4 novels so that it doesn't get too confused. And then I'll be looking at the historical context. So why are these 4 novels mentioning the late 19th century in Angola? Why is it such a significant moment in Angolan history and collective identity? I'll then briefly go to a point about a geography, about space, power and mobility in late 19th century Angola, before going on to probably the main part of the presentation, which is about gender, both in terms of family dynamics and women's roles, but also writing and masculinity. So this first novel I want to mention today is Alfredo Troni's Ngamuturi. It's a very short text. It was published in 1882. It's considered one of the first works of fiction of Angola, and its mode of production actually says a lot about the country's history and the kind of entanglements that Angola has experienced. Alfredo Troni was actually born in Portugal. He's a white Portuguese man, but he was deported to Angola. Angola that was until 1960 largely a penal colony. So convicts were deported to Angola as punishment, and Troni was one of them, except that he was one of the very few convicts that were deported for political opinion and not for crimes. So Alfredo Troni was initially a lawyer and a journalist in Portugal, where his criticism of the monarchy earned him this single trip to Angola. And in Luanda, he very much continued doing what he was doing in Portugal. So he was very important actually in developing the press, and he was also a lawyer. So he wrote Ngamuturi, which is like 30-40 page text. It tells the story of Ndreza, a girl who is sold by her uncle, who is paying a fine. So she is sold into slavery by her uncle and ends up in Luanda, where she becomes what was called at the time a mukama, so the concubine of a Portuguese settler. And she becomes his, not necessarily official, it's not really stated, but his concubine, his spouse, and therefore becomes Ngandreza, so Lady Ndreza. And what Ngamuturi is about her social ascension as this Black, vulnerable, formerly enslaved girl into Ngamuturi, Lady Widow, as her husband passes away and she becomes in control of his wealth. So it's very much the story of widowhood as an experience of autonomy for women. And Ngandreza, becoming Ngamuturi, also becomes a respectable member of colonial society in late 19th century Angola. So that is the first novel. The second one was published a few decades later, but actually covers the same, more or less the same period, the late 19th century. It's called O Segredo da Morta, The Dead Woman's Secret. And it was written by Antonio de Assis Jr. Antonio de Assis Jr. was actually born in Luanda, but he kind of did the inverse journey from Alfredo Troni. He was deported to Lisbon in the 1930s because he was criticizing the Portuguese colonial authorities. So he was also a journalist and a lawyer, and he was denouncing the ways in which the Portuguese settlers were expropriating the populations. And for that, he was exiled in Lisbon, where he died in 1960. So Segredo da Morta is a much more complex and much longer, actually, narrative than Ngamuturi. It opens on the description of a young woman called Chiminya Congalanga. She's a mad woman, and her madness is believed to be the result of a curse. And her story, the cause of her madness, is told by another woman, Maria de Castro, who relates the mad woman's curse to her former protector, Chiminya Belchior, who was a Black woman, a trader who had died recently. So immediately what we perceive in Antonio de Assis Jr. is a galaxy of portraits of women. So Ngamuturi focuses on one character, and Antonio de Assis Jr., on the contrary, tries to demonstrate women's networks, try to show the complexity of Luanda society through female characters. It's also a novel that moves away from Luanda. So while Ngamuturi happens exclusively in the capital after the slave girl has arrived there, O Segredo da Morta very much shows the mobility of women between the capital Luanda and its hinterland. I'll go back to what that entails in terms of Angola's history and in terms of processes of cultural exchange in Angola. So these are the first two novels that were written under colonial rule, that were written during colonial times, either as Angola was being conquered, or, and I'll go back to what I mean by conquered in the Conquest year, or right after Portuguese managed to impose effective occupation on its colony. Then we move to another set of two novels that were written after independence. The first one is a novel that was written by probably the most famous Angolan writer, Pepe Tela, who was born in Benguela, and as you can see is a white Angolan writer. And Yaka is a family saga of a family of Portuguese settlers, the Semedo family. It starts in Benguela. So Benguela is the second most ancient settlement of Portuguese in Angola. So the novel starts in Benguela in the late 19th century up to independence, but I'll only be focusing on the first part of the novel that deals with the late 19th century. And through the story of Oscar Semedo, who is, as we'll see, a degredado, so a convict that was sent to Angola, and the portrayal of his son and then his family, we really have the portrait of Portuguese patriarchs and lusotropical fathers. Lusotropical fathers is a term that was coined by Philip Rothwell. I'll go back to it. And finally, the last novel is A Casa Velha das Margens, The Old House by the Riverbanks. It's a lesser known text in Angolan literature. It was written by Arnaldo Santos, who was born in Luanda in the 1930s. A Casa Velha das Margens tells the story of Emídio, the son of a white Portuguese settler and a black woman named Kisama, who in the late 19th century, after being sent to Lisbon by his father, comes back to Luanda and then to the hinterland and tries to investigate the death of both his parents. And A Casa Velha das Margens was largely inspired by the writer's own family history. He explained that he wrote this novel as he was suffering a Great Depression, and he was trying to come to terms with the suicide of his grandmother, who killed herself when his mother was sent by her Portuguese father to Lisbon. And so the reason why I want to look at these four novels is because I want to see the ways in which the late 19th century is analyzed, is depicted, is portrayed by writers who directly experienced that moment, and by post-colonial writers that were writing after the independence of Angola. And I want to go back quickly to the sort of historical context of the late 19th century that was labeled by a Portuguese theoretician and a sociologist called Boaventura de Sousa Santos. What Boaventura de Sousa Santos said in an article that was published in the Luso-Brazilian Review, I think a few years back, was that Portugal was always a very ambiguous member of the concert of nations. It was always a very ambiguous member of Europe. And Portugal was always considered not to be completely European, not to be really white European. It was always considered, in other words, to be the Caliban of Europe, to already be some sort of savage in the European imperial psyche, if you want. However, what Sousa Santos says is that there were two moments in Portuguese history where Portugal kind of rose to another status. And he calls those moments the moment of Prospero. One of them was when was at the end of the Salazar regime, when Portugal joined the European Union, but I won't be talking about that. And the first one is the late 19th century, when Portugal was summoned by the other European powers to effectively occupy its possessions, or its the territories it had influenced on or claimed influence on in Africa, in the aftermath of the Conference of Berlin, so 1884, 1885. And this effective occupation, what it entailed for Portugal was that suddenly it was supposed to sort of measure up to European standards of both administrative control, but also racist stereotypes and divisions when it came to dealing with its African colonies. I am not suggesting that Portugal was not a racist country in dealing with its African possessions. What I'm suggesting is that up to the late 19th century, Portugal was happy to establish connections with African chieftaincies through the development of what has been labeled either the Luso-African elite or the Creole elite or the Angolense elite. So we're talking here about families, mixed race families, or let's say multiracial families, born from the encounter of European traders, settlers, and military men with African chieftaincies, and who became major brokers in the transatlantic slave trade. So with the Creole elite, on which 3 of these 4 novels focus, so all of them except Yaka that focuses on a settler's family, with the Creole elite, what is addressed in Angola in the late 19th century are also these transatlantic legacies and the ways in which the transatlantic slave trade shaped the urban elites of Angola. The fact that these novels are taking place in Luanda, Benguela, and in Luanda's hinterland also hints to a moment, late 19th century, that is not really a moment of colonial encounter, but a moment of brutal renegotiation of the relations between the African populations and Portugal. And the Creole elite was a group that lost a lot in this moment of Prospero. The racism that was adopted, the kind of scientific racism and social Darwinism that was adopted by the Portuguese authorities at this time, meant that the Creole elite that were multiracial were no longer considered adequate partners for Portuguese occupation and government, if you want, of the colony. So the Creole elite that had already lost influence because of the abolition of the slave trade was now being completely sidelined when it came to exerting political control, but also holding social prestige. And the Creole elite denounced this racism and denounced its exclusion from the spheres of power in a way that is profoundly ambivalent. It used at this moment so the printing press had arrived in Luanda in, I think, the 1870s. So it used the printing press to denounce the racism and discriminations they faced with the new Portuguese settlers and administrators in articles, in poetry, in fiction. But what they were saying, rather than really critiquing colonization, was that they belonged with the Portuguese elite and not with the Black indigenas. So what they were saying basically is that they were just as Portuguese as the Portuguese themselves, and even better actually than most Portuguese settlers, because they were educated, they were literate, in contrast with the convicts that were still representing most of Portuguese settlers at the time. So it's actually in the late 19th century that begins the connection between anti-colonial struggle, protest, and literature in Angola. So before I embark on the analysis of the novels, I just want to make a quick point about methodology, which is that here the lines are quite blurred between history and literature, between fact and fiction. Some of the writers actually use a lot of archival material from Angola, and others use family stories or stories that they have been hearing through their personal circles. What this means is that these novels create what Achille Mbembe called an alternative archive, so an archive that actually speaks back to Western historical discourses. It's important to note that as these stories were told, for example, by Alfredo Troni, and as the denunciation of European and Portuguese racism was performed in the press in Angola, history in Europe was being created as a discipline that was supposed to establish the European state, that was supposed to be the archive of the state and prove the sort of rationality of the state. So history was supposed to be the scientific discipline of studying the archive, and was of course completely oblivious, if not an actual partner, to the colonial conquest and what it implicated in terms of the erasure of non-Western history. In African studies, the question of authorial voice and historical narratives has always been very important. Whose history is being told, whose voice is being heard. And using novels is also a way to give voice to writers from these former colonies, from these countries, so that they can speak back to European imperialism, but also so that they can convey the complexity of their country's histories. And this is further done by looking comparatively at the novels. That allows not only to kind of bring out the historical consciousness, the collective identity that has been built, but also to look at the kind of conflicts and divisions that are already and still exist in these societies. So basically shunning away from simplistic narratives, either about Africa, about the West in Africa. Novels is a way to is a privileged, I think, vector for complexity and nuance in thinking about the historical processes. The first point I want to make is about the geographies of the conquest of Angola. So what I mean by conquest, and it's a word that is particularly used in A Casa Velha das Margens, is this project of military occupation of Angola's hinterland. As I said, up to the late 19th century, the Portuguese were happy to remain on the coast where they could trade and actually struggle to really control the interior of their colonies. However, with the Berlin Conference forcing Europeans who wanted to keep their influence in Africa to effectively occupy, administer their territories, levying taxes, imposing forced labor on African people, Portugal had to militarily occupy the entire colony. And this movement in the hinterland actually alludes to larger dynamics of space and mobility in colonial Angola. So I just want to look at a few of the places that are mentioned in the novels and what they imply in terms of the social trajectory of the different characters, either in terms of social ascension or social decline. The first one, of course, is the city. Luanda and Benguela, as I said, are the places where the majority of the novels are taking place. And it's not a coincidence. They have been largely Portuguese-controlled cities since the early 17th century in Angola. So they represent a space of opportunity. They also represent a privileged space of mixing. It's happening, of course, in conditions of heightened constraint and violence and exclusion, but still produced these new societies and the Creole elite. So what we see with the city is that it can be an upward trajectory, both for the degradado, so both for the convict that goes to the city to try to make a new living and be part of an urban privileged social group. So that's what we see in Iaca, because at first, Oscar Semedo, so who is the Portuguese convict who arrives in Angola in the late 19th century, first he is sent to Mossamedes, which is a very small, barely a town, just a very small settlement where he's supposed to be doing agriculture. As soon as he can, he actually goes to Benguela, a traditional place of Portuguese power, to become part of the colonial society. So it is an upward trajectory for him. In the same way, to some extent, Ndreza, as she is sold as a slave, she enters the city from its most vulnerable position. She is not a white man like Oscar Semedo. She is a Black slave girl. However, in the late 19th century, the city allows her to completely change her identity and go from this vulnerable enslaved girl to a respected and respectable Creole woman. So the city is the main place. However, the colonial city exists in relation to the metropolis. And the metropolis here plays in two important ways. The first, as I said, is it's the place from where people, or rather Portuguese settlers, are coming from. And in both Jaca and in a Casa Velha das Margens, two Portuguese men are being sent away from the metropolis because of gendered misconduct. Oscar misconduct being probably an euphemism in the case of Oscar Semedo. He is believed, he never admitted it, he says he's a political partner, but a political opponent, but he is believed to have assassinated his wife. So gender-based violence is presented as the very beginning of the Semedo settler saga. As for Antonio de Mendonça, who is the Portuguese man in a Casa Velha das Margens, he is sent away from the metropolis to Angola because he slept with a Black woman in Lisbon, and his family felt dishonored by that, and so sent him away to the colony. So in both cases, these degradados, or at least exiled men, are exiled because of either an unnatural union or because of a domestic violence crime. But the metropolis is also a place where the mestizo sons of Portuguese settlers are sent away. So the metropolis is also a place of Portugalization of mixed race children. In O Segredo da Morta, Chiminha Belcor's son is sent away by his Portuguese father to the metropolis. And in A Casa Velha das Margens, Emídio is also sent away to the metropolis. And in both cases, it's explicitly stated that it is to limit their Black African mother's influence. So there is really a sense of Portuguese fathers here feeling like their African wives, or at least African mothers of their children, are exerting a negative influence, and they are losing control over their sons, and therefore send them to the metropolis. So the metropolis is this place that swallows, if you want, the children of these black African women. In relation to the colonial city, you also have the hinterland. I show here a map of Luanda's hinterland. And what the hinterland does is a move away from colonial society to look at other processes of creolization happening within the African hinterland. So what it shows is that the creolization, the processes of cross-cultural exchange, go beyond the cities to go to the hinterland. So it shows profound processes of mutual influence, but it also shows the mobility of certain agents, especially women, as they trade and visit their network and their families across the hinterland. And to do that, to go from the city to the hinterland and back, the river appears as the major instrument of mobility. And what the river is hinting at are processes of fluidity, mobility, the possibility for these women to escape colonial influence, to go from one place to the next, to conduct a business. So there really is a sense of rivers and water, or river as opposed to oceans, as these instruments which can actually serve women's influence society, women's autonomy, women's power. So that was just a point I wanted to make, because I think the places where these novels are happening really matter. This idea that what we have here is a very long-term Portuguese presence that has given birth to new societies. And these relations between these creolized elites, the Portuguese metropolis, and the African hinterland being profoundly shaken in the most violent way in the late 19th centuries, as Portugal unilaterally changes its way of behaving and being in its colonies. And one of the ways in which the conquest appears in these novels is through the control of women's bodies. Of course, slavery is mentioned repeatedly, and it results in the objectification of women's bodies. In Gamuturi, although it's not dwelt on, this idea that this girl is sold as a slave to a Portuguese settler implies that there is some sexual violence that is taking place. And it says very explicitly that because she was young enough, she wasn't sent on a ship, but could actually pretend to be part of a Portuguese household, but she is still reduced to an object. The control over women's bodies also takes place through marital rape. So in A Casa Velha das Margens, so that's one of the post-colonial novels, Antonio de Mendonça is in a relationship with a Black woman named Kisama. Throughout the novel, this Black woman is named Kisama, and it is presented as her first name, and it is spelled with a K. So she is Kisama. However, Kisama is also a region of Angola. It's a region located in the south of Luanda, and it's a region that is known for its resistance to Portuguese occupation since the 17th century. The reason I say this is because there is a moment in the novel when Emílio de Mendonça remembers as a child peeking through, seeing his parents having sex, and seeing at the time that this didn't look like consensual sex, that this looked like a quite violent scene. And the way he mentions it, and this is a translation, all translations are mine, because A Casa Velha das Margens was never translated. Antonio Mendonça assaulted the Kisama, and she resisted passively. So here in that sentence that mentions this forceful sexual relation between the Portuguese white man and his Black wife or concubine, she is no longer Kisama with a K, she is the Kisama. So she is reduced to the place she comes from, she is exoticized, she is objectified. And the scene is told through Emílio's eyes, so through the eyes of their son, who witnesses what looks like and what probably is the rape of his mother. He mentions her passive resistance and mentions a bit later how it created great anxiety in his father, who knew that he could never conquer her completely, that it would always be forced upon her. So marital rape is presented as an aspect of this conquest, as the women's body and the land is clearly equated in that sentence. Yaka also has a rape scene. So if I think of the four novels, O Segredo da Morta is basically the only novel that doesn't explicitly mention forced sexual intercourse. In Yaka, rape appears as an initiation rite within colonial society, as Alexandre Semedo, the son of Oscar, as a teenager, with his friends, decide to rape a black teenage girl that is just passing by. And their rationale for the justification of this rape, which is brutal and violent, and where the Black girl, who is nameless, who doesn't say anything, is really presented in a very sort of powerless and alienating way. I'll go back to that. What they say is let's avenge white women. So there is this appropriation of the colonial trope of Black masculine bestiality and of Black men assaulting white women, so that they can excuse, justify, legitimate their own sexual violence by accusing the Black men of raping or wanting to rape white women. So the conquest, the colonial conquest, is clearly also written over the bodies of women and over the bodies of Black women. They appear as a prey, but it is presented in very different ways in the colonial and in the post-colonial novels. I go back to that in a minute. Another aspect of gender and power in late 19th century Angola is the ways in which women are connected or not connected to wealth. In Ngamuturi, as I said, the fact that she becomes a widow means that she becomes in control of her husband's fortune. In O Segredo da Morta, Ximena Belchior is presented as a woman who works, who produces, who puts other women to work, who knows how to earn and who knows how to spend. And fetish and goods appear as a sort of as a fetish for these women. It is a symbol of their social status. They are a member of the Creole society and say they are. Funerals are used for these displays of wealth. So social status and wealth and being in control of one's wealth is essential and very well portrayed in Ngamuturi and O Segredo da Morta. And the whole plot of O Segredo da Morta is that Ximena Belchior, this very wealthy woman, who was, again, autonomous, active, professionally, very successful, as she gets ill, she is robbed of some of her goods by several of her friends or of her protégés. So this, of course, gestures towards the kind of decline of Creole solidarity and the divisions within the Creole elite. But however, the fact that she gets robbed and dies little afterwards does not send an image of powerlessness. There is rather a sense of fury and injustice. And Ximena Belchior will come back and will haunt the people who betrayed her, who will die shortly afterwards. So O Segredo da Morta is a narrative about hunting and vengeance. It's completely different from the ways in which women are portrayed in the post-colonial novels. Kisama, the Black African women that I mentioned in A Casa Velha das Margens, is only presented as the concubine of Antonio Mendonça and the mother of his son. We know nothing about her family. We know nothing about her work, about any activities. She seems to have no sort of network of friends, nothing. So she is a completely anomic being in the novel. And in Yaka, which tells the story of a settler family, white women are similarly portrayed as quite disconnected to anything that has to do with prosperity, work, labor, apart from domestic labor, or political power and influence. They are actually just caricatures of submissiveness and bitter domesticity. They are very much the symbol of the kind of parasitic presence that white women were supposed to embody in the colonial setting, as Anne-Laura Stoller explained. So the novels in the late 19th century show that women are actually strong and independent, show them as very active professionally, having their own networks and managing their own financial resources and wanting to be recognized as such, whereas the post-colonial novels mostly present women as wives and mothers and fail to show them as autonomous beings. However, in most of in all the novels, what is interesting is that motherhood is depicted as a site of heightened vulnerability. If you take the first one, Ngamuturi, it's a bit paradoxical because we're told that Ngamuturi never managed to have a son or a child with her Portuguese husband. She wanted one because it would have been a way for her to secure her place in Creole society. However, she never managed to. And after the death of her husband, she gets pregnant by another man. But she decides to get rid of the fetus because she cannot be caught having a child out of wedlock, because that would actually threaten her respectable position in the Creole society. However, she has proteges, so she has other ways of enacting kinship and of protecting more vulnerable members of society. Two women have very close experiences of motherhood in the novels. In O Segredo da Morta and in A Casa Velha das Margens, Ximena Belchior and Kisama are presented as women whose sons are sent away to the metropolis. And this is the cause of both women's violent death. And this idea of women being deprived of their children sent to the metropolis is a major trope in Angolan literature and in Angolan nationalist landscape, if you want. And it echoes a poem by Agostinho Neto, who was a very famous poet and the first president of Angola, where he says, "My mother, all Black mothers whose sons went away." So we see how this became a trope of nationalist thinking and protest against colonial violence. So Ximena Belchior's son was sent away by his father, and she is said basically to have been overcome by grief. Kisama is a very different story. She's presented in the novel as having always resisted Portuguese influence. She refuses to speak Portuguese. She refuses Portuguese domesticity. She refuses to sit at the dinner table. And when her son is sent away, she kills herself, and she does it by hanging herself over the dining table. So there is a huge challenge to Portuguese domesticity as well. However, contrarily to Ximena Belchior, who comes back and haunts and kills her enemies and those who betrayed her, after Emídio understands that his mother, after he learns that his mother killed herself, Kisama sort of fades away from the narrative. So at first we're told that Emídio is trying to elucidate the death of both his father and his mother. But actually, once he knows that Kisama killed herself, there is no search on his part to understand her better. She completely fades away from the narrative. She sort of disappears. And he focuses actually on his father and his father's legacy. So there is a very clear erasure in A Casa Velha das Margens of motherhood and the mother figure, and a complete focus on the later part of the novel on men. And in the novel, Emídio surrounds himself exclusively of men. We are told that his sister was kidnapped by a Portuguese convict. He doesn't try to free her. So there is a sort of ethereal presence of female characters, and only male characters are given substance and personality. Which doesn't mean that they're portrayed in a very positive light. Men in these narratives are often presented as what Rothwell coined lusotropical fathers. And what that means is that these men are, so what Rothwell means by lusotropical father is that Portuguese men who could not become fathers in the metropolis, abandoned the metropolis, and therefore were never fathers to their own nation, had children elsewhere. And this is presented as sort of Portugal's gift to the world, right? To be sending these lusotropical fathers, having these mestizo sons. So in the first narrative, Ngamuturu and O Segredo da Morta, men are violent and vicious, but they're actually quite secondary characters. What lusotropical fathers stand for is the sort of violence, the concealed rape that actually goes with they being fathers in the colonies. So they're incapable of being fathers in Portugal, but they're also incapable of being decent fathers in the colonies because their offspring is the product of their power and of the violence that they impose on women. However, one of the characters, Antonio Mendonça, redeems himself. He was first an agent of the colony very clearly when he rapes his wife, when he's a Portuguese administrator. But little by little, he turns away from this Prospero role and Calibanizes himself freely and starts defending the people of Angola's hinterland. And the way he does that is by discovering an archive written in Kimbundu, an African language, and by starting to use this historical African written archive to defend African people against colonial expropriations. So there is a sense of a possible redemption, and this redemption goes through or is made possible by this discovery, this taking seriously of an African written archive. And to just finish with gender and power in 19th century Angola, the mestizo child, so we've seen women and mothers and then fathers, the mestizo child is presented as this figure of uncomfortable in-betweenness, traumatized by his own violent conception. He is both mestizo, but he's also lineageless, and that is particularly the case for Emidio. Both his parents are dead, and that means that he has no protection. So the way the child and the mestizo child is presented is as a highly vulnerable figure, but also the key to the new nation, to the forging of this path between European and African influences. So just to go briefly, again, to the role of writing and this question of the rehabilitation of masculinities through writing. This is mostly in a casa velha das margens. So as I said, Antonio de Mendonça, who was first presented as this agent of colonialism, actually then becomes the protector of the Africans. So as Emidio goes in the hinterland and he learns of the story of his father, remember that his mother is completely erased from the novel at this point, he discovers that his father actually was able to protect the local populations by being helped by the figure of the ambaquista, so African intellectuals who learned to read and write and wrote in Kimbundu the stories of the land. So basically saying who owned what in order to get evidence against Portuguese settlers in courts. And an ambaquista tells Emidio what was at stake was a cult to which he had devoted his entire life and that he still abided by, the art of teaching how to write. It was more than just the writing down of old proverbs in a legible way. He learned to rethink the world with the words, putting ideas together so that they would call on one another, move and persuade, respecting their order and their connection. And that science failed to be transmitted through the cane of the monarchy schools. The ambaquista students were more and more necessary to face up with the times, to cancel judiciary processes in the local courts, in the press, in acts and contracts between men, because between men whose words of honor had lost their value. So what is interesting in this is that this rehabilitation is exclusively masculine. It's only men who explain to Emidio what happened. It's only men who are writing this archive. It's only men who understand how writing is key to the survival of some sense of fairness and some sense of collective identity in the hinterland. So this rehabilitation of African masculinities against the brutality of the male conquerors goes through writing, but also through the erasure of women's voices and perspectives in the process of writing. And of course, that echoes what the post-colonial writers themselves seem to be doing, because in the 19th century, novels that were written in the 1880s and in the early 20th century, women are central agents and haunting figures. So they really are key to understanding Creole society and to understanding social networks and the culture. After independence, and here I quote Eleke Bomer, "It is the sons who are the authors of meaning, whether of tradition or of present social realities, whether of their own self-image as national representatives or of the women they would presume to represent. Underlying gendered values remain intact." So what we see in the post-colonial narratives is a rehabilitation of African masculinities, an inversion of Western stereotypes. However, this happens by erasing women's perspectives. And the late 19th century appears key here for the writers themselves, because it is the moment when writing channeled political discontent, collective memory, and the cultural creolization of Angola's hinterland. Thank you. Let me...
Well, let's see. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I understand we've gone over a little bit, but I don't know how much time we have, but we can at least give a chance to anybody who has a question. And I see there's a question from Aliko. So let me see if I can allow Aliko to ask. Okay. Aliko, if you'd like to, see, I think I have to unmute you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Yeah, my question is about, this rich tradition. I mean, it's very bad for women, but it's a rich tradition of literature. How did it affect, or what is the legacy of this literature in contemporary Angolan literature?
So the legacy of the late 19th century literature, you mean?
Yes, yes.
Yes. I think it was quite strong. It was quite strong, and it inspired the anti-colonial struggle and the anti-colonial cultural movements in the 1950s, in the sense that Luanda is very much, I mean, the people who were writing in these journals and who were publishing in the late 19th century were part of this Creole elite that remained in Luanda and remained, although marginalized and less powerful, still had its traditions and still told and transmitted these stories of resistance and denunciation of the Portuguese rule. So I think they were actually a major inspiration to the intellectuals in the 50s and 60s who denounced Portuguese colonialism and did it through fiction and poetry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Jackie has a question. I'll read it and then I'll unmute you, Jackie, in case you want to add something. So Jackie asks, by erasing women's voices in order to foster ideas of collective identities and rehabilitate men's masculinity and national narratives, are the authors, particularly the African ones, then not themselves colonizing women's experiences? Can we read their works in more patriarchal cultural conquest lenses? And I'll unmute you, Jackie. So, okay.
Yeah, to clarify, I meant colonizing women's experiences and perspectives. Can we really, can we better probe their ideas about national narratives and its connections to masculinity? You know, and you were making great points about how women ultimately lose, right? But can we also see it in more patriarchal terms, in terms of they're also colonizing women's experiences in history? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. By colonizing, are you talking about the 19th century writers or the post-colonial writers?
The post-colonial ones.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
So I think one point that I probably should have made is that Angolan nationalism was very much marked by their anti-colonial armed struggle. So it is a fact that because Portugal refused to negotiate with the nationalists, or to even, you know, consider the independence of its colonies, and this is happening not in a democratic setting, this is happening in a dictatorial and authoritarian setting, so where discussion is simply not possible on the political arena. The nationalist movements went to war in Angola, in Mozambique, and in Guinea-Bissau, so virtually in all Portuguese colonies. And these anti-colonial armed conflicts lasted over a decade, and I think they explain a lot about this erasure of women's voices and about this putting forward of a sort of nationalist masculinity, you know, redemptive violence, if you want. So in terms of colonizing women's experience, the thing is, they definitely took advantage of it, in the sense that nationalist movements were also actually painting themselves as putting forward women and encouraging women to participate in the struggle. But yeah, the truth is, it was almost impossible for them to actually imagine women as historical agents. Just very quickly to conclude on this, Arnaldo Santos, it's Arnaldo Santos's mother who was sent to the metropolis by her father. But in his own narrative of this family story, he replaces her mother with a masculine figure, that of Emidio. And I think that is very telling of the inability of these post-colonial writers, who I should say were also, for many of them, raised in the kind of colonial society that was strongly patriarchal, to imagine women as historical agents.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothee. Any additional questions? Let's see. No. All right. I think Aliyah, you mentioned you might have a question. I'm not sure whether you would like to pose it at this point. Yes, well, I'll ask, I mean, until you think of other questions. And I understand we can stay another 10, 15 minutes and also completely understand if people have other commitments and need to leave the meeting, I guess, this virtual space we're all inhabiting right now. So, as I said, I mean, it was a really interesting talk, fascinating talk for me. And the question I have is basically, you know, it's almost like a cheating question. And you have 4 novels. I mean, they're really interesting novels. And you focus, the second part of the talk focuses on post-colonial writers. And I'm wondering if you've done work on Agualusa on the other hand, on one hand, because I mean, his first novel was historical. It goes back precisely to this turn of the century period. And then he has a later novel, Estação das Chuvas, or the rain season, I guess it could be called, in which he takes precisely the figure of a female poet who inhabits a very ambivalent space within nationalist, the nationalist struggle and so forth. And the other figure, so I mean, this is just kind of a, you know, pick what you want. And the other figure that comes to mind is Castro Surumenho, a writer, I mean, not only because he did teach at Wisconsin back in 1960. Taught here, yeah, he taught here for a semester or something like that, I believe. I could be wrong, but I think he did. And, you know, his especially the 3 novels, you know, the trilogy, are really interesting in a lot of different respects, but for the representation of both Black African women and settler women as well. And I think I'm just wondering if you can just pick one of those and talk, you know, a little bit more about you know, what your impressions are, what your take is on those writers. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Yes, yes. Actually, the first version of this, there have been many versions of this chapter article. At first, it was a chapter of my thesis, and I wasn't so much looking at the 19th century novel, but I was comparing A Conjura, so by Agualusa, with Yaca and A Casa Velha das Margens, and it's quite interesting because Agualusa is definitely from a different generation, and he really has less toxic masculinity kind of going through his prose.
It's my generation, so I'll take that as a compliment. My generation.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, but it's true. I mean, it's quite visible in the way he writes. He's much more aware of this, and he plays with these tropes in ways that are much more creative. While denouncing sexual violence. However, it was interesting because in A Conjura, it was still women were very much stereotypes. And there were fun stereotypes, but they were still quite marginal in respect to the novel. And that's also because he was looking very much at political activities in late 19th century Angola. He's looking at the elections and the fraught processes of elections. And you know, like most of his story is about a barber, and most of the political discussions are taking place in a barber's shop where you have no women. So he actually still recreates these masculine spaces. And I remember the different portraits of women. You have this Creole woman that is, you know, horribly snobbish and doesn't want to admit that she speaks Kimbundu, and you have another one who is presented as a very kind of devilish seductress. So in his first novel, he's actually still building on these stereotypes and quite male-centered, and he does much better in Estação das Chuvas. And Estação das Chuvas was an incredibly provocative novel, and the fact that his main character was a woman, I think, was kind of participating in this questioning of the Angolan literary canon. And it's very ambivalent and unhealthy almost connection with the MPLA and the post-colonial regime. So yes, he's I think he's changed on this as his opposition to the regime got stronger.
Yeah, and I guess we could think about Creole Nation as well in that, from that perspective, as you know, really kind of trying to rescue a strong Creole voice, female Creole voice from that period as well, and in sort of response to the Portuguese canon, right? To a novel, sort of a sequel to a novel by one of the realist masters of Portugal. So I mean, there's all that interesting stuff going on. So
yes, and he was one of the first ones to actually talk about slavery in Angolan literature, because for a very long time, you know, it was only the anti-colonial struggle, because that was kind of easy, you know, Portuguese versus us, the Africans. When you start mentioning slavery in your novel, it's much more ambivalent, because then it's also about the complicity of the Creole elite, and that was much more difficult to sell in the kind of nationalist narrative.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have a question from Chris McCormick, and I think it's kind of a continuation of what we've been talking about. And I'll unmute Chris after reading the question. So do you have any recommendations, asks Chris, for post-colonial novels written by Angolan women that might counter the marginalization of women? Now, this is interesting. I'm interested in this one too. So.
Do you want to unmute Chris? Yes.
Yes. You see, I can't get to it. I mean, I'm not being very good at this. So let me see. Yes, I just did. Yeah. So.
That's just my question. I'm just interested if you have any recommendations for us.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you ask, because actually there are very, very few, and I'm realizing right now that there is one person I'm thinking about and her name escapes me right now, and it's terrible. So basically the idea is, especially if you compare with other Lusophone African countries, Angola's literary landscape is incredibly masculine. It's incredibly male-centered. At independence, they created the Union of the Angolan Writers, and the only woman writer that is part of the kind of founding members is the wife of Agostinho Neto, who was the president of Angola, who has written, honestly, very, very little. So there have been, I don't want to say almost no women's voices. There are a few, but generally more in poetry. And their names escape me right now, which is terrible. But it's in fiction, in novels, I think there is like one novel that has been written by an Angolan woman and has been published and available, and the rest for the moment has not been published. It's an incredibly male-dominated scene.
Thanks. Yeah, she just published her first novel, right? I don't know if we're thinking about the same writer, but very recent, like maybe in the last 2 or 3 years. But I mean, one of us can track down her name, and we can.
I'm thinking about someone who published a longer time ago, like almost 20 years ago.
Okay.
But yes, but she only published one novel, and that was the end. So if you compare with Angolan writers who've been publishing, many of them for 30, 40 years, women have been incredibly discreet and silenced to some extent.
No, it's a very male-dominated literary universe. I mean, in that sense, again, not because I'm from Mozambique, but Mozambique does slightly better. I mean, it has a few prominent women writers and I mean, who are prolific and have been extensively published and so forth. So
yeah, it's incomparable. Yes.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I'm not sure. I guess if there are no questions, we can thank our guest for a very enlightening and informative lecture, and we'll see you next time, I guess. Thank you so much, Dorothee. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this. I hope you will forgive my technological inaptitude, but I'm an older generation. I grew up without a phone or without a television, so this is really advanced for me. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Dorothee, Aliyah, Dinah, everyone involved in putting this together. This is a challenge, but I think we did okay. So
thank you so much. Thank you very much for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye.